Okay, I'm Albert Levis. I am a psychiatrist and the innkeeper of the Wilburton Inn. In 1987, I completed this book, which is called Conflict Analysis, the Formal Theory of Behavior. And I had a sense of great discovery of a certain important message that I developed through this research. And I wanted to have a place to display art and to illustrate what I was talking about in an abstraction within this book. And the abstraction is that the mind resolves conflict by going through a predictable path of emotions, and that this entity is the unconscious. And the unconscious is something that now we can understand as a physical entity, which has also moral properties because it resolves conflict. Conflict resolution is, for me, morality. And it has always been a difficult thing to understand morality and agree about morality. As you know, we're celebrating an anniversary of the 9/11. 10 years later now, bin Laden is dead, and the world is experiencing some relief. But it isn't enough to eliminate bin Laden, Hitler, Hussein, and other enemies of the public. We have to understand morality and religion because it is affecting people with passion. And what I would like to share with you is that we have come to the point of being able to understand morality as independent of religion, therefore making religions less able to inspire people into fanaticism and either kill or be killed in the name of a book of God. And the interesting theme that unites the sculptures here is the change of paradigms from the stories people believe in, books that tell a story about God as one particular believable story, and to move from that paradigm of the story to what is universal in all stories, which is the plot of stories. And so the paradigm shift is moving from one way of thinking that people now are captivated by, inspired by the book as a story, to being able to think more abstractly and seeing that morality is a real thing, but it is something that's more elusive and universal. And if you think, what is the plot of stories? All stories have a plot, but nobody has bothered to really understand this as a mechanism, as a scientific phenomenon. So yours truly somehow stumbled on the idea of being able to understand the plot of stories as a mechanism. And this mechanism is very simple, and by the time you're through with working with me, you'll understand that we have a good grasp over an alternative to religion. Religions are scientific discoveries, my friends. They're scientific discoveries of this unconscious mechanism of a natural science phenomenon. So the exhibit that we have here as a sculptural trail around the grounds of the Wilburton Inn is about reconciling science, which now understands morality perfectly, scientifically, abstractly, with religions which have been a series of discoveries of this mechanism. But religions discovered the process, the mechanism, the scientific mechanism partially. And each religion discovered part of the elephant, part of this mechanism. And each religion claimed total discovery. And the religions are misleading the world because they think in their discoveries of moral order, they have a universal truth. And they are inspiring the people to be fanatic about it. And religions also discovered the conflict resolution, regulating family relations. And family relations evolved in the history of civilization. And they also, religions attributed the discoveries of how to resolve conflict to divinities. So if we are going along with this sculptural trail, we are retracing the history of religion as the evolving understanding of family relations and the corresponding attributions to divinities, to gods. So we have here an opportunity to see how religions are really a progression of discoveries, but how science comes now to put an end to religions, because religions now are only partial truths and science has the total truth. And this is what is important. We are placing both the unconscious and psychology on a scientific basis, and we're also placing morality and religions on a scientific basis, and we're showing the deficiencies of religions as well as the strengths of religions. So conflict resolution is about taking two opposites and evolving a third, which is a composite reconciling the two into a new unity. And this is what this is about. We're starting with science, we are looking into religions, and we're evolving a new paradigm. And we have sculptures for everything. We have sculptures understanding science of behavior, and I'll give you some examples in terms of the sculptures. We have a section which is about retracing the history of religion as the evolution of family relations, the evolution of the role of women in the family, the evolution of love, the definition of love. And we have a third part which is about the abstract sculptures redefining what is morality, that we have to celebrate morality, but giving it a totally different context, seeing the scientific dimensions of morality and being able to worship a new concept, be inspired, be spiritual, without being tied down to one story. You know, the beginning of my research started as I have had the problem personally with understanding my identity, in the view that I was born a Jew in Greece and that I experienced the Second World War as a child. And as a child we went to hide to protect ourselves from the Nazis. 96% of the Jews in Greece were deported to the death camps. And I felt curious and guilty for surviving and understanding you know, what happened to the world. And I wrote a play about Hitler, trying to understand his mentality by studying another war, which was a genocidal war. And I became aware, using Greek mythology, of patterns that repeat in Greek mythology, and very cruel patterns in the Greek family. And that is when I bought the house that you know as Earth, Sky, Time, because Earth, Sky, and Time were the original Greek family. And there is tremendous amount of hostility between father and son. But what was remarkable about that kind of observation is that there is a pattern that repeats 5 times in the Greek creation stories, and at each level of that generation being transmitted, the pattern is transmitted, but some resolution is happening. So we have Earth, Sky, and Time, which are the primordial figures, evolving to the next generation. Kronos is the Titans, and then we have the Olympians, and after the Olympians you have Athena and her son Erichthonius. And in each one of these conflicts and resolutions you have the attribution of divinity passing down from the sky to the Titans, to the Olympians, to Athena on Acropolis, and then to Erichthonius, who is king of Athens. So you have a sense of less polarization between humans and gods. And I saw that as a conflict resolution mechanism, and understanding the pattern intrigued me to become the scientist of patterns and to see here science in behavior. Now, this sculpture here is a very interesting sculpture because it does communicate my sense of discovery about patterns that repeat. And here is an Easter Island head, and what is special about it is it has a tear. And the tear reflects, this is my sad wizard who has written all the stories and all the explanations of religions and psychology and ideologies like communism. And here is the a representative of all these authors and all the prophets, and he's crying. He says, how come after all my stories the world is not living happily ever after? And science, the scale representing science, is saying to the wizard, don't despair, the secrets to happiness are in all stories. The problem is that people believe the stories as the truth rather than examine what is universal, rather than being scientific. They are focused on believing a story and getting carried away with passion. The problem in the world is that we have not discovered the nature of the plot of stories. So the exhibits that I have displayed here are understanding the plot of stories. And so religions discover that plot of stories, but they discovered only partially. And to illustrate this process of conflict resolution, I look for an artist to make some art for me, to present it as reciprocals and opposites and correlatives, the abstractions of the formal theory. And then I visited several artists, and when I saw Henry Gorski's art, I said, it's remarkable because you don't have to do anything for me to illustrate opposites, reciprocals, and correlatives. Here, Henry Gorski had everything hanging on the walls already. And I asked him to let me borrow some of his paintings to exhibit them at the conference, at the lecture. People understood me better, and I kept collecting his artwork, which was very easy because it's so loaded with intense emotions that nobody would buy it. And so I was very lucky to be able to gradually to acquire 110 canvases of his, and that's part of the museum. I use the creative process as manifested in paintings to show the symbolic language evolving in a predictable manner. And what you're seeing here is the simplicity of this artist's language. He's using paintings to express his feelings, and his feelings are evolving from a conflict to its resolution. But the simplicity is in the fact that all his paintings can be reduced to the mouth, or at least I have collected the ones that represent emotions through the mouth. Here the mouth is blocked by fingerprint, oppression, conflict. And here the mouth is screaming. So you see from passivity you go to activity. Here the mouth of God is kissing Adam. So you see antagonism below and cooperation. And then here you see the mouth of the artist as in the center of a crucifix. And the idea here is that he calls it identity, and it's a resolution. He's able to deal with the identity of a person who is suffering and a person who is willing to find an identity in the religion. And one thing that is very interesting here is Gorski is an artist, and he is using any symbolic language, and every artist has his own symbolic focus, you know. So it can be that you have a fixation on the mouth or a fixation on the hand, and you know, any number of symbolism. But all of these languages have the same kind of logic: passivity to activity, antagonism to cooperation, alienation to mutual respect. And these are the three scientific dimensions that we can measure, you know, how aggressive is a person, how passive is a person, how cooperative, how antagonistic, how alienated, how resolved. And this makes the science. So what I want to say is that creativity, the language of the unconscious, is projected into a system of symbols. And this is what we're seeing in a story. And the symbols have a flow, always starting from a conflict and going to a resolution. And what I would like to also illustrate here is that the mind creates a story, and the story has a sequence of emotions in it. We're enjoying very much the story when we go to a movie, but we do not look at the plot. Well, here we have been able to understand the story and to be able to understand the technology of utilizing the story to understand and measure the individual. And while we're having here this kind of focus on the head and the scale, I want to show that the tear comes down, the pain, as the story. And the story, can be continued on this little chain, which then has the evolution from beginning to its end. And then what we're doing in the technology of assessment, we're taking the stories as a complete beginning to the end. We put them on the scale of measuring how people resolve conflict, and look at the scale and see, if a person is submissive, if he's dominant, if he's cooperative or antagonistic. So I just wanted to say we have science, and science has advantages of being able to measure. And so we have demonstrated with a measurement that the theory is correct, because the test that I developed, the personality assessment, which has both an inventory and projectives, is something that you can see the statistical kind of evaluation of the assessment, shows that the mind does follow these dimensions, and that the mind becomes measurable. And we have the ease with which to validate the theory, but also make it useful. And when you do your animal metaphors and the relational scale, you identify very quickly how you resolve conflict and how the science is behind this pattern of resolving conflict.
So Dr. Levis, you were talking earlier about this evolution that happens in the creation stories of the Greek pantheon. You have Earth, Sky, Time, evolving into the Olympian gods, and evolving all the way down to the King of Athens. And I don't know too much about the history of these stories, but I think most of them were oral, and they kind of had a fluidity to them. They had an evolution that was happening across time. And I think you see a good example of this probably also in the Jewish tradition and some of the other Abrahamic traditions, until the point that the books were written down. So could you go into detail a little bit more as to what happens to the evolution of the kind of moral development of these stories once the stories are actually written down and kind of set in stone and become a canon?
What is interesting, be that Gorky painting his canvases or the world creating mythology, is that you see a continuity in the symbolic transformations in each artistic creation.
Sure.
And this is what I think is remarkable, and you do not ask necessarily, is it true or not true what the story says. This is judging the content.
Right.
And what you're looking at is the process. You see the sequencing of transformations. And this is actually the methodological point that I'm presenting. The world has been very preoccupied explaining, for instance, the story of Genesis. Right. Was there anybody there to record what God was doing and putting it in the New York Times as the official story of the creation of the universe? Of course, it is a made-up story. It is not something that people can rationally discuss about scientifically. And this is where I object. Science until now has been focused in people contradicting Genesis, because they said, now, religion believes the creation of the world in 7 days, and we know that this is not true. So therefore, God is dead. And the Vatican started looking at stars with more respect. But again, morality is not improving or disproving Genesis or the Greek gods, creating the universe in 5 generations. The morality is in the process. And in all of these systems, these stories, you see this transformation. So if you look at the Greek gods, you see the pattern of how they become less cruel. And if you continue to the Jewish kind of story,
Right.
you see again a mythology about Abraham. Did Abraham listen to God telling him to sacrifice his son, or was he testing his wives and seeing who is going to cooperate and be willing to trust him with her son, even if he was going to sacrifice him?
Yeah.
And so, we have to look at stories from another logic. Now let's continue on the sculptural trail. What you are seeing here is a lady and 3 dragons. And this is an installation typical of my concept of developing an awareness with sculptures of other people. This is Barbara Kaufman's ceramic and Barbara Kaufman's lizard or dragon and other people's work. But I'm installing them here to convey a concept. And the concept is conflict. A lady and 3 dragons. And the idea is to show the nature of the plot of stories. So every fairy tale is predictably moving from the conflict, the lady and the dragons, always dragons and always ladies, to a resolution. And there is another set of sculptures behind you which has the happily ever after. There is a sculpture there, the red sculpture, which is Don Quixote and Dulcinea, the sculpture of happy Don Quixote. Usually, there is a happy end. In that particular story, it's kind of a sad, tragic story. But here they're coming to the Wilburton to find being happily ever after, getting married. We're in the business of weddings. And that's one of our good love stories. And I see the boy-girl kissing as representing resolution. I see the lady and the dragons as representing conflict. And a resolution here has the characteristics which are related to the characteristics of conflict. You see the lady and the dragons there are in an emotional position with each other, that you have the definition that you said from looking at the Gorsky paintings of conflict as passivity, antagonism, and alienation. And passivity, we had before in the sculptures, in the paintings of Gorsky, the absence of the mouth, the antagonism being not being loved. You see, this is the mouth of God kissing him, and this is his screaming mouths, and there is his resolution, where you see the real mouth of the artist and his eye centered in the cross. So if you look at the properties of conflict here, and you look at the kiss over there, the kiss and the embrace, you're seeing the properties, the mathematical properties of what is resolution and morality. So let's take a look at the kiss again, and let's look at also the embrace, the other sculpture. And what I'm trying to communicate there is that we have the physics of resolution as mastery, the act of kissing rather than being passive, cooperation rather than antagonism, and mutual respect. That's very important. And over there you can see, I call the sculpture the embrace. I call it also civil union because it doesn't have feature of gender markings. And so you have the concept of a union between equals, and it reminds me also of the Twin Towers and the idea of the symbolism of mutuality, which was undermined by the fanatics. All right, so what we have accomplished with this first part of looking at the wizard and the scale and looking at the fairy tale is looking at what is the first part of the sculptural trail, was presenting the scientific foundation of morality. So we do not really need religions to define what is morality. As a matter of fact, religions discovered how to resolve conflict along the parameters of mastery, cooperation, and mutual respect. And I like to show you some sculptures where you can see how the world gradually discovered the notion of men evolving mastery over the female, which has always been the conflictual part in working a relationship of love, and trying to discipline the woman from running away, and just domesticating the wild woman. And then you have India, which discovered cooperation, the submission to the woman and being willing to repress desire, to respect women. And then we have the discovery of mutual respect in the Judaic religions. But in the mutual respect that the Judaic religion developed, it's mutual respect between father and son. So the new concept of morality includes all of these religions respecting conflict resolution, spirituality, encompassing mastery, cooperation, mutual respect. So let's take a look now at each one of these stations. We have here two parts of the next sculptural trail which retraces the history of religion. The first one is the Epics of the Goddess, which is about matriarchy and the taming of the shrew, the taming of domestication of the woman. And the other one is the problems of patriarchy and the problems of the Bible in fighting women and having it backfire on itself with the messianic religions, which brings us to our times, and how we can get out of that with a new moral paradigm.
Are these two separate resolutions, or are they in progression? Does one happen before the other, or are they instead of each other? Is this like a positive one and a negative one? Or?
It's the same artist creating it, and I guess he was puzzling out the issues of conflict resolution or love. And he utilized his symbolism of the figures in parallel and resolution. And he's the same artist that did some other sculptures that are abstract, and they symbolize more abstractly this kind of issue of what is the process of love. We begin here with the second part of understanding how to make sense of religions. So we have talked about science, and now we're looking at religions as discovering this concept of conflict resolution gradually as civilization is evolving. And we're going back in time to the jungle, to the primitive cultures, where the world, the family as an institution is starting to be developed. And the paramount power in that original family was the woman, was the mother. And you can see this symbolized here in this sculpture, which I call the torpedo breast, which has symbolism both of the importance of the nurturance of a woman and also the realities of our lives today, where we're very dependent on oil and gas as terrestrial products, and how precious they are, and we're little piglets addicted to this breast. Now, at another level, you can see the phenomenon of developing family relations. If you go back to the Aztec family and the Aztec mythology of the Americas, and that is a very interesting civilization, very interesting culture. And we visited the Yucatan at some point and became more interested and more aware of the mysteries of that culture. Well, they have pyramids, and on top of the pyramids, they have human life sacrifices. They open up the person's heart, take it out, and give it to Chakmul, who has a little dish. And that's pretty cruel. And you wonder, where this tradition came from of life sacrifices. It is the beginning of discovering religion, discovering also family relations. And the mother is very powerful. And the mother is a real monster. They are portraying the mother as a woman who has the head of an eagle. She has around her neck a necklace of severed hands, heads, and hearts. And she has a skirt full of snakes entwined. and she has talons for feet. So this is the mother who is bloodthirsty. And there is the Aztec calendar, in which you have the 4 cycles of destruction of the universe and the impending 5th destruction. And to avoid that impending destruction, you have to have the life sacrifices. And the Aztec civilization was cruel because they had to feed the mother with this kind of sacrifice of humans. So they were chasing other tribes, sacrificing them to avert the destruction of the universe. That's a pretty cruel, conflictual way of being a family. But that's where the family starts. And there is where you see passivity, antagonism, alienation in the person. And what I have down here is an example of that culture, mythology of that culture. The Mother Earth had a son and a daughter. The sun and the moon are her children. So she sends her son, Huitzilopochtli, to kill her daughter, Huayachacli, the moon, because she was threatened by her daughter. And mother-daughter relationship as a conflictual relationship was the beginning of that mythology. And the sun, when the sun rises in the morning, he kills the moon and the stars, his siblings, on behalf of the mother. That's a pretty darn cruel conflict resolution. But that is what kept that family and that culture inspired to behave. Now, that interesting cruelty is presented also in the metaphor, which is still alive in Mexico's flag. And what is in the center of the Mexican flag is an eagle and a snake. Now, as an animal metaphor, learning to be sophisticated about interpreting symbolism, you have a very powerful partner and a very powerless one. And this symbolizes the power structure. And the life, by extension, what you're seeing in the drug wars in Mexico today, is this kind of war game between the macho people who are powerful like the eagles and their enemy who is crawling down like snakes, and how helpless and ephemeral life is, because for no reason at all you shoot the enemy, you sacrifice him to the new god of wealth. Okay, now from here we're going to Greece, and where you see the transformation of the mother figure to a woman who is able to be married and stay faithful. And you see how Greeks managed to do that. So you asked me before, how do stories evolve and which is the real truth behind the story. And here you have a typical response to that. Well, in another part of the world, far away from Mexico, the Greeks had to deal with the same problem of the powerful mother coming out of the jungle. And the Greek stories that tell us how the Greeks dealt with it are the famous epics of Homer. And both epics, they're being very respected for poetry, for character development, for interesting way of flowing the battles of war and so on. But there is something that has escaped the analysis of the Homeric epics, which is looking at how they reflect the formation of family relations. And both epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, are about women being domesticated. Well, Helen of Troy is presented here as a sphinx. And the reason I've chosen that sculpture to represent her is because the sphinx for me represents the woman who is fighting and flying, fight and flight being a psychological way of responding, resolving conflict, fight and flight. Now, what is the story behind Helen of Troy? She had 10 boyfriends. Matriarchy allows a woman to have freedom, not to account to anybody. But the 10 boyfriends said to Helen, make up your mind, marry one of us. She chose Menelaus of Sparta. But then what did she do? She continued falling in love with other people. So she flew the coop. She went with Paris to Troy. And the Greek men said, you took your vows, come back home. She says, come and get me. And she became a lion. So this is the kind of interesting dynamic that evolves with matriarchy in many different cultures, fighting the domestication, submitting to the rules of men. But the Greek men were pretty smart, and the smartness is also presented in Ulysses, who is fighting single-handedly in the Odyssey seduction. And he is the man whom I like to think of as an example of restraining of power and having control and wisdom. He says to his sailors, "Tie me to the mast. I want to hear the sirens singing, but I do not want to surrender to them." And this is power management. You know, this is the wisdom of the of the second Homeric epic, and it is brilliant. And there is a number of relationships that he's going through. He and his wife, Penelope. Penelope is besieged by suitors who want to marry her, and she's parting, but she's saying, you know, let me have more time to think about it, and she's saying, when I finish this shroud, and so she's knitting during the daytime and unraveling at night. And I guess it's also reflecting the difficulty of women having relations, becoming obsessive compulsive, or anybody having to you know, make a decision. And poor Penelope, she had to make a decision, do I or don't I? You know? And so she's the obsessive compulsive case of raveling and unraveling. So let's take a look now at Penelope as a sculpture. And so the statuesque woman here reminds me of a Greek tragic figure, you know, a little bit like Medusa. And you can see how she's looking down over the swimming pool, which could represent the Mediterranean, and she's looking at what is happening with her husband, who is island hopping, bed hopping, while she has to say no to the suitors. But again, this is the wisdom of the Greek family concept, and women learn to endure the suffering. And a lot of the suffering of these women is presented in Greek tragedies, and all of them have, practically all of them, have names of women. And what is interesting in the relationship, the evolving relationship, is not only the Oedipus relationship that we know from, you know, this kind of psychology of psychoanalysis, where the woman is in love with her son and supporting this relationship at the expense of her husband. What you have is the children finally coming to the point of killing the mother. And this is what's happening at the end of the Trojan War with Electra and Orestes, who are ganging against the unfaithful Clytemnestra. You know, when Agamemnon comes home, Clytemnestra kills him with her lover Aegisthus. But that's not the end of that story. You know, the next generation will put the mother in her place and says, "Mother, this is not acceptable, be faithful." And so there are many stories showing how the child rebels at the witch, the mother, and so the mother learns how to behave herself. So you have here an innovation in the institution of family relations. And you see how we're moving away from the eagle and the sphinx of Mexico to a woman now who is a sphinx, but she's beheaded to become domesticated like Penelope. All right, so what we're doing is going from culture to culture, seeing how each culture discovered a different way of resolving conflict. And we talked about the three challenges of resolving conflict: mastery, cooperation, mutual respect. Well, India discovered cooperation. And this is my definition of what is cooperation. It's the person who is here as Shiva dancing on a little kid. And you would think this is cruel. But my explanation of what this is about is the celebration of being able to dance on your inner child. And your inner child is what is here. And why do I say that? Well, from Hinduism we evolved to Buddhism. And what is Buddhism? The Four Noble Truths of Buddhism. Life is pain. Being stepped on is pain. Desiring creates pain. So stop desiring. Step on your child. And cessation of desire is relief of pain. and then the Eightfold Path of Enlightenment, which is moderation. Now, I think what happened in India is kind of an interesting story that ties in with Greece. One of Zeus's lady friends was Eos, which means moon. Eos was a wife of a man by the name Argos, and Zeus had an affair with Eos. And Hera, his wife, came in and transformed her into a cow. And she gave 100 eyes to her husband, Argos Panoptes, to watch over her. Hermes came to rescue this cow lady, and he sang or he played music or something, and all the 100 eyes closed, and the cow escaped. And the cow jumped over Bosporus, which means the jump of the cow, and she found her home in India, where cows are sacred. And cows are sacred is the respect of the moon goddess as well as the woman. And the moon goddess being respected, then you have men cooperating, respecting. And the whole philosophy of Buddhism that evolved in India is about cooperation. While the Greek men like to rape, Olympian gods are pretty well known. Zeus for his 50 affairs with boys as well as with girls. In India you have restraint, and this is where you have the concept of passive resistance, of being yogi and becoming a pretzel, to show that you have total control over your body and your breathing and feeling happy and relaxed rather than desiring, and having self-control. This became an art as well as a religion in India, and people respect it. But this concept of total cooperation is, again, a very partial way of resolving conflict. It is good next to the other ways of resolving. But this is what India discovered, and the world must be grateful to India, discovering a scientific way of resolving conflict that works very well. Now, the reason I mounted this sculpture on this is to show that we have gears and cogs, and the human being is becoming a cog in the wheel. So if you have the metaphor of the wheel for Greece, the man being a big wheel, here the man is becoming a cog. And you see this beautiful sun figure with flames and power, enlightenment, as part of the reward for this kind of behavior. Now, the three wheels that I have behind are presenting Kali, the moon goddess, her waxing and waning, and they're presenting Kali with her 6 arms as the spokes of these big wheels. So here you have the constellation of the powerful mother and the repressed male, the self-restraining male. Okay, now let's see what happens in China and Japan. I am addressing another culture here, China and Japan. And what happened in the family relations, in the history of love, is that we have cooperation there, but the gender power is changed. And in China, women, we know the strange habit of binding their feet. And in Japan, we know the symbolism of the culture of the rising sun. And so the dominance is shifted from the moon to the sun. And this is kind of symbolized here in the reality of a woman becoming a geisha. And a geisha is the kind of role of a woman of being very cooperative and being serving with her wisdom the male authority, which is presented here as a dragon. And that is a great system of having family relations, and that's why Japan is so cooperative and productive, because you do have tremendous amount of authority, respect of authority, and this is a very important, kind of figure as a dragon, and the kind of spirals that are presenting in this dragon show this kind of spiral process of conflict resolution, and behind this dragon there are 2 scythes, 2 plows, to show how productive this kind of family resolution is. You have respect of authority, but you don't have mutual respect. and you have the polarization of power in the male rather than the female. And this is one way of taming the woman, but is this the end of definition of happiness and love? And this is what these sculptures are helping us to think. You know, religions evolve as paradigms of family relations. And so what you're having here is a transformation of the discovery of cooperation in India into the discovery of cooperation, but the reversal of genders in Japan. I would like to show you another sculpture before we part, and what it represents relationally. You know, it is the person who is in a lotus position, breathing deep and reflecting, meditating. And he's not the person who is changing the world. He's not aggressive. He's restraining himself. And this is a model of behavior that is very civilized. But again, it says, you know, hold your feelings to yourself. And it's problematic when you don't have a sense of being able to communicate and have a balanced interaction. And this is part of the limitation of this kind of religion, which engages the person to surrender himself to society rather than be individualist and to provoke conflict. It's too much repression of conflict. And you have these retreats in ashrams where people go there for a month and they're not supposed to open their mouth for a month, which is training of self-restraint and being happy, just breathing deep and feeling content. But is this health? You know, this is a solution of conflict, but it's not a universal way of resolving. This is the station that I call the Gilgamesh epic. Some of you know about the Gilgamesh epic. It's the story of a war between men and women. Gilgamesh is a prince. Ishtar, the lady here, is a beautiful lady, and she's promiscuous. And she's propositioning Gilgamesh to be her boyfriend. But here you see in the reaction of Gilgamesh the protestation of a man in his relationship with women. And it's a beautiful diatribe, the argument he gives her about her not being a suitable partner. And he's insulting her. He says, what did you do with your lover from last year? You are the most vicious creature in the world. I would rather not be with you in a room or in a relationship. And there is a war, and Gilgamesh has a friend who is a superhuman, Enkidu, and the woman has her father and her army to fight Gilgamesh. At the end of this situation, Enkidu is falling victim to the horrors of Babylon. He's weakened and killed. And Gilgamesh, instead of continuing the war, he's retiring from that struggle, but looking for eternity and looking for his father figure in Enkidu. And so the story here is the beginning of the Bible, in the sense that the Bible starts with a seductress that gets men out of paradise. Adam and Eve story is inspired from this. And also the father-son covenant, which brings man, father and son together to restrain themselves from depending on the mother, on women. And so I wanted to show you this because it's the beginning of the Jewish tradition, which is another story which extrapolates on this story and is still the paradigm that we have today, which makes women look bad. And it's because of this woman that women have been mistreated by the Abrahamic stories. Across the way here we have a sculpture that is broken. And I say Abraham did it. It is Abraham started his career by breaking his father's pagan idols. And what I'm saying with that kind of a presentation of Abraham is that Abraham was trying to diminish the destruction that men suffer because of beautiful women. And this is the origin of the burqa. You know, a woman has to cover her body and not be beautiful because it's creating conflict for men. And so the story of this Gilgamesh epic ties in with Judaism and with the Abrahamic family and the ambivalence at that time where Abraham began with his wife going around the universe, and he said to his wife, it's all right if you sleep with the king of this particular country. You can make friends. If you tell them that you're my wife, they might kill me. This way you can make me friends. And so this is not because he was a pimp, but it is because at that point in that culture, hospitality was more extensive than having people having for dinner. And Abraham was the one to eventually draw the line of what is acceptable for the role of women. And so he repressed finally the role of women. He divided women. He had a couple of wives and children, and he managed to conquer and develop the reward of the woman who is willing to be a good mother, trusting him with his child. What I wanted to, kind of conclude with is how religions discovered science by discovering these different dimensions of conflict resolution. So we have mastery in Greece, cooperation in India, and mutual respect in Judea. But mutual respect between father and son, not between man and woman. And this is what we're having now in our times, where women have reclaimed respectability. And this is what we're fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan. Another part that I would like to emphasize is, well, you see the power structure of the family there, the dragon and the geisha. And the dragon here is becoming a groveling snake with a smile, because I want to show the transformation of power. From the geisha, you have here a beautiful, voluptuous, irresistible woman, and the man groveling to get a kiss. So let's go beyond and see the evolution of cultures with sculptures. So what I would like to reiterate is the first section of the trail was about science versus religion. And science clarifies that it's about conflict resolution, and there are three relational transformations that happen to define conflict resolution. And here happens to be three sculptures that remind us, this is an artist who plays with art figures, okay, but he created with these art figures the relational modalities, the relational principles that resolve conflict. And I want you to see how modern art gets away from presenting specific figures, mythic figures, religious figures, and you have abstract forms. And this is where we're going into science. And I picked up these sculptures because they help to identify the three principles of resolving conflict. And the three principles are here presented as sculptures of relational alternatives. So this is representing a pendulum going back and forth, and the forth is power, the back is powerlessness. So you have reciprocity, and you have the principle of balance in the move of back and forth. The fourth is power, and the reciprocal is powerlessness. And you can see the kind of structuring of our thinking in terms of these opposites. And here you can say the Greek woman had power, and then the men took that power away from the women and put them in a position of powerlessness. Now, India is the concept of the opposites, and the opposites are cooperation versus antagonism. Antagonism is the idea of oppressing somebody, like the Greek people who oppressed the women in their stories, and you have the children, for instance, killing a mother. Clytemnestra was killed by Electra and Orestes. In India, you have cooperation. You have the respect of the mother. The mother becomes the sacred cow. The mother becomes the moon. And so to represent the difference between Greece and India, simply think of clockwise and counterclockwise. Clockwise is cooperation, counterclockwise is antagonism. And so when we have a graphic representation of the pendulum oscillation, and you have a kind of a cross-section of the oscillation, if you go clockwise, you're going cooperatively. The opposite is counterclockwise. Now there is the third principle of conflict resolution, which we see in the Judaic stories, and the Judaic stories are about mutual respect. Now, when you look at the sculptures of Japan, the geisha and the dragon, you see a disparity. You see an element of alienation. The woman doesn't have an equal standing. When you see at the Gilgamesh sculpture, you see the woman powerful and the man just groveling a little snake. Again, you have an asymmetry. And so that is symbolized by this stone, which moves up and down this totem pole. So when the stone is up high, you have imbalance. When it is too low, you have imbalance. When it is in the middle, you have mutual respect. And the person is neither alien by being too dominant or too submissive. And so these are the three principles with which we measure behavior, and measure both individual behavior and also we measure the behavior of cultures. And so I just wanted to throw this as the evolution of art becoming modern, and in this evolution having still the possibility of understanding the art in a meaningful way along the principles of science. Okay, from here we'll continue back into the presentation of the Abrahamic family and to see the story of Abraham resolving conflict with his women. Now, what do we have here? Here we have an interesting modern sculpture. And what I like about the sculpture is that it has, in the abstraction, it has two features. Number one is the feature of having three piles of stones. 1, 2, 3, separate from each other. And then it has a headstone, a single headstone. So in this abstract sculpture, I see how the artist evolves a powerful metaphor for conflict resolution, which consists of 3 acts. It's a dialectic. First act, second act, third act. And the dialectic of Genesis is about the 6 days of creation, which is a dialectic of evolution. You know, God created this in the beginning, and then that in the next, and that and that. It's an evolution that goes to Sabbath, the day of rest. And so the headstone is the head of is the image of you know, the accomplishment of resolution and the celebration of resolution. Now, the second feature of this creation that impresses me a lot is the mirrors. And these mirrors represent what is interesting about the creative process, which is self-reflexive. What does it mean? That when you write a story, the story is about yourself. And so you look at your creation and you find who you are. And if you look at the sculptures here, in front of the sculpture you see who you are. And you see also the evolution of the ideas in a dialectic that has 6 steps. And the 6 steps are a universal awareness of something organized. And so you have the chakras. In India, there are 6 chakras, and there is the 7th, which is on top of your head, which is the same thing as saying the 7th day of the week, the Sabbath day. All right. So from here we go back to the sculptures that are more figurative. But I wanted to keep in mind that what we're talking about here is the unity of a story, the unity of a story that has a structure that is defined by the principles of science over there, and also by the fact that we have a unit which is circumscribed as 6 steps.
Can you talk more about the science behind all the issues of morality that you're bringing up?
It's all about science, and what we're saying is that the mind evolves in a predictable fashion, in a periodic way, resolving conflict, and that the mind is like a mental heartbeat. It moves, like you're seeing in a story, repeating a pattern, repeating our story so many different ways, and always organizing things. And I have found two ways of presenting that mechanism. One is the pendulum oscillation, going back and forth, but the mind stops after 3 oscillations, which are representing also the 3 acts of a play. Why does it stop while the pendulum continues swinging back and forth forever? Because the mind transforms energy from chaos to order. This is what Genesis is about. Creation, not of the universe, but creation of order in a symbolic system, in a story. And so they use the metaphor, like a story does, as the universe created in 6 days. But it is really about the organization of any symbolic system. And so every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And Aristotle identified that looking at Greek plays. And he said they have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And they have a beginning which is hubris, the insult, the arrogance of the Greek person. And then there is the adventure, peripetia. And then there is the reversal of roles. And then there is dike, which is justice. And the gods send the emissaries from Deus ex machina, the emissary of the gods hanging from a pulley, telling the outcome of the transgressor, the punishment he gets. And then there is catharsis, which is the experience of release of conflict, and everybody identifying with the pain and suffering of the hero. Now, this is the science. The science is looking at this unit and saying it has the same dynamics as the pendulum oscillation. And also there is another model talking about balance, which is the scale. Now, if you take a weight and put it on a tray of a scale, it creates an imbalance, conflict. And how do you correct that imbalance? You're putting another weight on the other tray, which is called reciprocal behavior, passive or active. Or you can remove the weight, which is the opposite, which is cooperation versus antagonism. Or you're shifting the weight on the fulcrum, which is called correlation, which moves you from alienation to mutual respect. And so you have here 2 scientific paradigms, and you say behavior now can be an object of scientific analysis using the constructs and the formulas of physics as well as logic. And this is where we can be aware of the fact that, we're talking here about science. We're talking here about transforming religions and giving them dimensions, and being able to graphically present them like pendulum oscillations or like equilibrial positions in a scale. Well, now, what you have here is deliberately a lot of broken sculptures. And the particular one on top of the rock was a sculpture named Joy. It was a dancer balancing herself on one leg, and it fell off and broke. And now I call it Broken Joy. But the reference is important. I say Abraham did it. Because what did Abraham start his career with? He took a hammer to his father's pagan idols. What is the pagan idols? It's beautiful voluptuous women that you see in Greek statuary, but also you see that there in the Gilgamesh story with that lady with the, kind of naked body and, very desirable, attractive features. But, what does Abraham replace that woman with? He replaces it with a wheel. What is the wheel? The wheel is the idea of Genesis, the creation, the periodicity, the celebration of this alternative entity, this story. And the story that has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and every week you're celebrating. So the periodicity and the model of the story resolving conflict becomes his shtick and his contribution to the cultures. And everybody believes in Genesis as though it was for real, rather than just a story that becomes total reality. And so here we have the problem of getting away from the power of women, for the broken sculptures and shifting our paradigm to the story of creation and the creation with a God, the Father-Son covenant story. And so this is how I highlight Abraham's beginning of making a shift in paradigms as well as in the power of women. Now we continue seeing this story of Abraham and his personal life with some more sculptures down below. Sculptures that we're going to be seeing for a while are about the evolution of the woman in her in the biblical stories. Now Abraham, who is the patriarch, the founder of Judaism, had to deal with women, and he had an issue. He wanted to have an heir, and his wife was unable to give him a child. So apparently he had a child with one of his servants, wife servants, Hagar. And at some point when Sarah saw that Hagar has a child, she had a child too, 90 years old or so, according to the story. And then she wanted to have her child be the heir to the Jewish tradition. And so this is where Abraham had to make a decision at some point, and in his decision he let the concubine go out in the desert with his firstborn, Ishmael. And so here is presented the woman who is transformed into a beast of burden, into a camel, and her child who likes to have war toys. And this is something that helps to explain the mentality of the Islamic woman who is oppressed now and whose child is so ferocious and so willing to sacrifice himself, blow himself up, or do some killing. And it's because the mother is so frustrated and so repressed that the child becomes the vindicator of the mother. And so you have here the mother-child component playing against the father-son component, Abraham and his alliance with his son. So this is my Hagar in the desert, and this is the Islamic woman with the burqa, trying very hard and being willing to support her child's aggressive behavior. What you're seeing here is the evolution of the woman from a beast to an angel. And this is the Christian woman who is a mother, but at the same time we call her a virgin, because the idea is the total angelic identity of a woman without any personal power play. And the power that we talked about before, mastery, what is a woman's power? Her sexuality and her child. And so this woman is an angel because she's sacrificing her own pleasures and her own power through her child. And so I have her as the woman who also, with the broken sculpture next to her, represents the mother with the martyr next to her. And the whole picture of this spiritual position is what Christianity is about. Christianity is repressing the individual's desires, just like Buddhism is. You kind of try to avoid desiring and be spiritual about things. And you see the spirituality in her face. You see her being pious. You see her being pure, being white. And you see her also wearing a burqa. So you're losing the issues of the voluptuousness of a woman and her creating conflict in a man's heart. Now, we have seen the transformations of women along the paradigms of, I call it the epics of the goddess. And the epics of the goddess is presented in all of these stories that different civilizations created separately from each other. It's not like a dialectic, like the Greeks came after the Aztecs or the India came after Greece, but people in different places of the world discover different ways of resolving conflict. And in each one of these noble stories, you have a different choice of how to handle things. But if you put them together, you see the discoveries of this scientific process, mastery of man over woman, the woman of the jungle who is powerful. You see cooperation in India, and you see the idea of mutual respect, but now between father and son. And that's what we're going to see in the next sculptures. So the signs that you see here on the wall is what remains from a bat mitzvah celebration for my oldest daughter. And because in Manchester we did not have a Jewish congregation, so we did a home project of studying the Bible. And so we picked up, a summary of the Bible and highlighted the phases in the history of the Bible, made signs, and then the kids wrote skits about the different episodes in the Bible. And so we had a beautiful time, walking around the grounds with a mower and a wheel, the vacuum behind it, and putting these signs in different places, and the kids have had a lot of fun. And it is after that experience that was very enjoyable and creative that I said, maybe we should have real sculptures in the history of the Bible. So I ventured forth and bought myself a piece of land for the temple, thinking that I'll have my sculptures in the back of the temple. But then that didn't work out, and so I bought myself the Wilburton, and I said, I'll have here my sculptures. And so we started with putting up different sculptures commemorating that event. And here you see the story of the Bible with patriarchs, 2000 before Christ. These are the commandments coming out of Egypt. This is Judges conquer Canaan after Moses, kingdom united, kingdom divided, exile in Babylon, and post-exile. And some of the things that you're seeing here have a lot to do with this evolution in the history of the Bible. And you have the stations that you're going to see from here retracing that history of the Bible. And that is where it all got inspired from. Now, what we have also as an interesting aside, addition to the signs, is this is Sarah. I call her the lady of the nipples, or chicken soup is ready. She looks like a vessel rather than like a woman. And this is what happened to the mother, domestication to the hilt. So the bar mitzvah boy is wearing a yarmulke, and he has learned something, so he says, slow. And kosher cuisine is symbolized as Pepsi. There is here a kind of a geographic metaphor, because now we're retracing the history of the Bible. And in a way, the history starts from the Exodus from Egypt. And this house is like a pyramid, and in front of it you have a sphinx. So it reminds me of Sphinx. And this driveway is like the Red Sea. And Moses is there, this leader here, who is guiding people out of Egypt. And this is an interesting sculpture of Moses. You can see his hair standing up like antennas to pick up the vibes, listening to God. You can see his mouth trying to pinch manna, the food that comes from the sky. You can see his wise eye here in the center, and the balance between his beard and his hair. And how, there is a little flow, movement. And what is interesting about this sculpture also is positioning, and this whole area looks like the Sinai, and how the Jews wandered through the desert to find their way to Canaan. And what you have in the background is the patriarchal family, the Abrahamic family. And they look like Egyptians. Well, Moses was an Egyptian prince. So if he was dressing up the patriarchs, they would be looking like pharaoh figures. But what's special about Moses' patriarchs and pharaohs is that they're all the same stature. And they're all equal in size. Abraham sitting in the front, the two other people, individuals could be Isaac and Jacob, father, son, and grandson. And then you have 4 little sculptures in front of women, and these are the matriarchs, there are 4 matriarchs for 3 patriarchs. Now there is a little unfair asymmetry there. And then there are 2 big birds, the Horuses, Egyptian Horus birds, which are like the bookends. And my interpretation of this sculpture, which has nothing to do with the intention of the artist, who is Judith Brown, and the sculptures were as an Egyptian theme in the Lincoln Center in '84. My interpretation is this is a biblical family that shows the patriarchs of equal stature, the women being demoted, and it shows the concubines symbolically represented by these birds, and we can call them chicks in the modern language for the girlfriends. And so this is a kind of a moral sculpture, a milestone in the history of morality, but it is immoral from our perspective, from normative perspective. It says civil rights, equality, equal opportunity. The genders are in equal status. And so this is a sculpture that helps us to see the evolution of paradigms and the evolution of stories, and see a beautiful story, but at the same time, don't believe stories. And I am in the process now of doing some more sculptures which are about storytellers that have really misled the world. And one of them is the Holocaust with a bust of Hitler on top of it and the insides of a furnace split open to show the cruelty of the furnace. Another one is with Marx and signs of the Russian Empire and how that misled the world and to a lot of pain and suffering. And then next to it there is also Freud, who created an interesting interpretation of the unconscious, but also misleading people into a psychology that of sexuality that distracted us from understanding behavior and created an ineffective psychology, so much so that today psychology has gone into biology, chemistry, neurology, rather than understanding emotions. And now we're making a shift back to understanding emotions in a logical fashion, meaningfully, predictably moving from conflict to resolution. But the basic element is don't trust the stories. Don't trust the story, because the stories are giving you the wrong kind of interpretation. They're biased. Be that Hitler's Mein Kampf, be that Marx's Capital, be that Freud's psychoanalysis. They're limited stories and people believe them as the total truth, and they are getting carried away. And so we have to rethink what is morality and what is scientifically the essence of what is the mind psychology relations. This is a sculpture that I almost forgot to talk about. It's very significant. I call this the altar for the sacrifice of Isaac, or the test of love. And I see Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac as the way of his testing the love of his son and the love of his wife. And I see, it's my interpretation of the story that God didn't talk to Abraham, but Abraham set it up as a way of making a distinction. You know, who is the most loving, most willing to sacrifice himself member of his family, wife or children. And he's testing his wives is a very important factor. People like Kant, the philosopher, looked at behavior of Abraham and said he shouldn't have listened to God and sacrificed his son. There is nothing moral about sacrificing your son. Of course there is nothing moral about it. But I do not think that really he wanted to sacrifice his son. He was simply checking out, you know, who would be willing to self-sacrifice himself. And you know now the self-sacrifice of people besides Jesus, of the fundamentalist Islamic young people who commit suicide. And they are also experiencing the same kind of dilemma, you know, if we love God, let's do the ultimate sacrifice. So it is in that spirit that Abraham was testing his son as well as his wives. And he was able to say who is more or less willing to self-sacrifice. But here we have the goat as the dispensable sacrificial animal. And so Abraham managed to stage it in such a way that he could test his wives and his sons, and he could also honor respectfully God, which was the metaphor of the maximal authority. The history of Judaism is after you come into the Sinai, you find your way to the Promised Land. And the Promised Land here is presented with some buildings. So this is the building which I call Jerusalem, Kingdom United. And in front of it has a couple of lions. And each one of these chambers there is dedicated for one of the kings. So there's a suite for David, for Saul, and for other kings of Jerusalem, and the history of the glory of Judaism in around the synagogue, the temple. And then from there, the Jews got in trouble. The kings, fell in love with women and they forgot God. And so you have Solomon and David getting in trouble with girls. And then eventually the Jews lose this kind of strong faith. And then you have the Jews being punished. So you have kingdom divided, the two houses below. And then as you go down the hill, you have the Jews in exile in Babylon. And in Babylon, they built, they released the Bible. So we have a big sculpture of the Bible. And that's where we have the other additional sculptures now, each one about a story that inspires, but in the wrong direction. This, for me, represents a metaphor of the Bible and the importance of the Bible as a story for the Jews exiled in Babylon. When the Jews lost the security of Jerusalem, the kingdom, that we saw a kingdom united up there, they were in exile, and they were in a very interesting cosmopolitan community that was into justice and into storytelling and into libraries, and it was a great culture. And I think at that point the Jewish response was, let's write about our story. And they put together all the oral stories into a book, and that's the Bible, which was published, in some ways with stones in 800 years before Christ. Now, why is this a tribute to the Bible, and how is this a metaphor? I call it the bride and the groom. The one sculpture on the left is the bride, is the book, and the groom is the tall figure, which is the people of the book, and which is here symbolized as a rabbi with a big nose, a scroll on his shoulder, and his hand pointing to Jerusalem. Now, all of this, of course, I made it up. The artist didn't have this in mind any more than Judith Brown had in mind the sculpture of Abraham as being a sculpture of Abraham. But I found it convenient and comfortable in the setting, trying to make people aware of the passion that people have for the book. And if you go to a Jewish congregation, you see how people love the book. They pass it around in their arm, and everybody kisses the book. You dance with the book. You get spiritual, you get excited. And so this is the power of the book. And the power of the book is what mystifies the world today, to have different books and different stories and different ways of defining God, defining women, defining goodness, and fighting, to the point of sacrificing one's life. And this is the kind of question that science comes in to improve on. Beware of your stories. Your stories are partial ways of understanding conflict resolution. And this particular beautiful story doesn't respect women. You respect the book much more than women. The bride is not a woman. The bride is a metaphor for loving the book. And when you love the book, then you can get carried away, because the book tells you different messages, and everybody has his book and different interpretations of reality. So cautious about books. And next to this sculpture, I want to make 3 other monuments, which are the books that have created the disaster of the 20th century. Marx and his Capital, Freud and his psychoanalysis, and Hitler and his Mein Kampf. And the idea of having Hitler's reproduction here is not because we're respecting Hitler, Freud or Marx, but because we have a need to be learning from history. You know, that these books have misled the world and have caused a lot of pain and destruction. And we need a new paradigm to stop hurting each other, to stop attacking New York towers, and to stop attacking, you know, anything that symbolizes a new civilization. And it isn't enough to kill bin Laden. We have to understand conceptually ourselves, our passion for religion in a particular way of resolving conflict, and be able to move from political correctness, which respects everything, everybody's religion the same way, and move to conceptual correctness, a scientific understanding of morality. This is our virtual Jerusalem, and this is the chariots of Alexander. And Alexander besieged Jerusalem and brought to Jerusalem a new culture. He brought in science from Greece, as well as their Oedipal complex. So in a way, it changed very much the orthodoxy and restrained values of Judaism. And men took up sports, they go into the gym. Women took to look pretty and being nicely dressed rather than having a burqa. And the values of the culture changed. And you have the influence of the antagonistic competitive culture of Greece coming in to liberate women and to create a little bit of conflict. So girls got pregnant and they were about to be stoned for getting pregnant. And that's where Jesus comes in to protect the woman from being abused and oppressed. And that's where Christianity comes in as the influence in the Judaic tradition that questions the values of traditional Judaism. And where you have this rebellion, this popular rebellion that was led by Jesus Christ. And so in these sculptures here, in this Jerusalem, you'll see an interesting conflict unfolding. You'll see the men in the center talking about justice, and you see the women peripherally protesting. This is a sculpture of Moses. It's the same guy who did Moses that we saw the other place. Only this one is standing on top of the 10 Commandments. And here he's walking, looking at the moon. And here is his smile, here is his hairdo and his beard. And here he's walking, looking at the sky for instructions by God. And here are the rabbis sitting around like they do on Sabbath, you know, spending the day talking about the law. Now, while they're talking about the law, the women peripherally are complaining. And so right here behind you, you see a woman who says, God is not with the Father and the Son, the Judaic definition of God. He's with the mother and the child, which is the Messianic definition of God. And so here you have a real revolution in terms of moral values and paradigms. And this is where Christianity and eventually Islam came in. And Islam also is the mother child, but metaphorically presented as the crescent and the star. The crescent is the kind of alliance of the moon and the star, the child, mother and the child. And so you have here the metaphors of matriarchal traditions coming to undermine the Judaic patriarchal monopoly. Now there is another sculpture there which has a banner which says, girls are as good as boys. also in the same line. And I didn't make these sculptures. These were made by a woman who is rebelling at the values of our culture. And you can see it, it says clearly, girls are as good as boys. And this is the emotion of the woman, both in our times, could be in the Islamic culture. A woman stands up and says, we have rights. We can drive a car, we can vote, we can go to school and have an education. Girls are as good as boys. And so what I'm looking at here is the transformation of the family, from the patriarchal model to the equalitarian model. As an aside, a little funny thing. I had found on the grounds of the inn, in one spot underneath the bushes, a bikini bottom and 2 empty glasses of champagne. So I put the bikini bottom underneath the sculpture of Moses, and I had the lawyers of Jerusalem debating the dress code at the Wilburton Inn. Here, what we have here is a very interesting installation. What I have done is I'm juxtaposing 2 metaphors. The metaphor of the books and the metaphor of the plot of stories. The metaphor of the books is presenting the concept of how to be a bird according to the Quran, the Bible, and the New Testament, and how each one of these stories gives a different values system to the person and the culture. And then on the other side we have, if you like to take a look at that part, essentially what you're having there is a labyrinth. And the labyrinth has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Here is the beginning, and I have 2 little pigs starting their exploration, and they would like to learn how to fly. And in the middle you have Pegasus, who is giving flying lessons. And then you find your way out, and you're a happy person. You have your end of the story, beginning, middle, and end. So what I want you to understand is we have 2 paradigms here throughout the trail. We started with a wizard who is crying, and he says, how come after all my stories, he is the author of all stories, the world is not living happily ever after? And the science tells him, don't believe stories, but see what is universal in all stories. They have the secrets to happiness. And so here you have a chance to review. Now you're more aware of the books, and you see the difference between the books and how they can confuse people. So look behind you. The first is birds within cages. And what does this stand for? Well, Islam means to submit. Islam means to be in a cage. You don't open your mouth, you don't criticize. And if you do criticize, even if you make a caricature of Muhammad, people are starting to get very insulted and rebellious and ugly. If you write a book like Salman Rushdie, you get a fatwa which says, you have to die, you insulted us. And so they do not allow criticism, they do not allow growth. And that is the problem of that culture, which has a rigid way of managing power. And that's what you have now in the Islamic countries. You have the role model of religion affecting the political structure of the society. You have dictatorships. And all the younger generation are rebelling at dictatorships. They want to get out of the cages. And dictators do not allow them. Be that Gaddafi, be that Assad, be that Mubarak. They're all interesting phenomena of that culture, of absolute righteousness of the authority. Now what do you have here? this is my birds of the Bible. The Bible says it's okay to challenge God, wrestle with God, and you remember Jacob became Israel after he challenged his brother in his nightmare, or it might have been God, the angel of God. And so the Jews welcome criticism, they welcome questioning authority, wrestling. And Israel means to wrestle with God. So these are the two big birds with open mouths, singing, squawking, but in a way there is a different definition of how to be a bird. Now, this is another book and another message. And this is the metaphor of Christianity as a crown of thorns and as being able to survive pain. Here is a cross that was suspended here that has broken down, but very appropriately so, because what I'm saying is the bird is defined here as cooking to become chicken soup of the soul. And so you have here another definition of how to be. So each one of these books gives you a different paradigm, and the world cannot stop having wars because each story is in conflict with the other story. And what we need is to move away from these stories and to redefine morality scientifically. Now, what we have here is different animals, and you can see I have a pig, I have a chicken and a rooster, I have a cow and a pig, which is, moving along the trail. And each one of them is the division of our emotions. We'll do an animal metaphor. So it creates a story, and you see through that story exactly who you are. Not how to be, but who you are. And what you want to change about the way you are to finally fly and finally find the sense of conflict resolution in the person. So my friends, this is my message through one of the art exhibits of the museum. We have a number of exhibits, and each one is reinforcing this message that the mind is a scientific phenomenon that we can understand and measure and graphically portray and quantify and utilize it as an educational instrument to find out about enlightenment, to find out about the world that has preceded us, and being able to integrate the religions of the world, be able to understand wisdom, not just philosophies which never give you any particular clear message, but as something that has direction. And my belief is that we have to come to a new civil right, which is called emotional literacy, moral and emotional literacy, where you can expect in education to learn about interpreting metaphors rather than being a puppet to your metaphors. To learn to understand yourself, which is self-knowledge, and to learn clarity of moral values. Today, religion has been banned from the classroom because there is so much conflict with religions. Well, we need to come to an awareness that religions discovered good things, how to resolve conflict, but only partially. And we need to deal with our religions in an integrated fashion and move from the religion to the science. So at the end of religions is moral science understanding morality. And so this is a great place, not only because you are farming nicely and creating the magic of creations, and you have a nice community, but also because there is a message that the world needs. And we have a most beautiful facility. And this is a place to welcome people who come to learn good life and moderation, cooperation, and mutual respect.
So, Dr. Levis, one thing that's interests me about taking this tour is that the evidence that we're using in the scientific process of understanding morality and understanding conflict revolution, are these cultural stories, these stories that have been created, outside of whether or not they're true, like they've been created through a culture and they've been refined and through their retellings, to the point where there's a clear morality. Um, but I wonder, for one's personal psyche, are these stories an effective way of understanding oneself, or does one have to analyze like their own stories of their life, or of their understanding of the world?
This is a good question, and the program that I have developed as emotional education includes both moral education and emotional education. The moral education is really cognitive, education. Like this is part of that education, understanding the creative process by seeing the art exhibits, and understanding the symbolic language of the mind, being able to read it. But the counterpart to that is doing your own artwork, and then in your artwork finding about yourself. So there is the complement of cognitive, which I call enlightenment, and doing your own experiential thing, which I call self-knowledge, or creativity for self-discovery. And that's the next challenge if you like to play with me.
Okay, well, I was just speaking to the fact that I had been presented with a situation in which I was raised and born in a congregational church and attended quite frequently and regularly, and we were definitely a family that were recognized as full participants. And it wasn't until I was about age 12 when I had built enough confidence to ask my father more in depth about his beliefs, whether he believed in God, in which he responded with a resounding no, which was shocking. But he went on to sort of explain to me that he did believe that a man named Jesus probably did exist in some form, but he was a common man who lived a life that was morally directed and positive, and one that was worth taking notice of as an example. So in that vein, he continued to serve his community within this church, even though he wasn't believing in the text itself in its totality.
And this is the drama of our world, where we're going along with our religions without necessarily having to believe all the stories of the religions. And there is always beauty and power and meaning in religions, and then we are willing to not question things that are observed.
You're incorporating science and religion, which are two things which have so classically been at odds with each other. And I don't know, I guess my biggest thing that I'm thinking about after this whole tour is how realistic it would be to expect religion to invite science into the discussion.
Through the medium of art.
Through the medium of art, which is universal. So I think you're onto something.
Well, we have an object that we can all study, and the object is the plot of stories, the organization of emotions in a predictable manner. And the paradigm is the mechanistic paradigm of the pendulum oscillation and the equilibrium of the trace of a scale. So we do have something to measure and to test the ideas. Am I another storyteller or am I a scientist? If something is measurable, then let's see how does it all amount to. And this is where the validation comes in to reassure us that we are onto something really valuable. And the emotional relational modality scales, as well as the metaphors, will help to convince you that here you have something reliable, predictable, measurable, and moral. All right, folks, thank you very much.